Hello, precious, beautiful community. I just sat down to talk to you about a question several of you have asked about the latest totalitarian turn in Russia. But I've just changed my mind about what I want to talk to you about when I've sat down, because I thought, you know what? Let's talk about something that none of us might be very enthusiastic to gather around for a conversation about, just if we name it. But once we think about it, it's actually really important. So I feel that we'll have an important chat for the next 10 minutes or so. And that's about just how we negotiate the information environment and how we maintain adequate standards of trust in it. And in a certain way, this blew up just in the last few days with Tucker Carlson's interview of Putin, because the single most striking thing about it is that it's a very important piece of something that isn't but claims to look like journalism, that is done in detachment from two very important things. It's done in detachment from a journalistic institution, and it's done in detachment from the psychology of professional journalism. I find it hard to imagine how journalism could survive without institutions. I think if you got rid of all the journalistic institutions and you just had journalistic practitioners working as individuals on Substack, that would be a world without journalism, actually. It would be a world with journalists, maybe, but a world without journalism. But nevertheless, on an individual basis, you still can be a journalist if you practice the psychology. I mean, for goodness sake, look at me. I've got a health condition and I'm not affiliated to a university. But just at a psychological level, it would be ludicrous to claim I'm not a philosopher just because I so obviously am one. It'd be like saying that a rock isn't a rock. So, of course, in Tucker's case, he's brilliant in other ways, entrepreneurial ways, riding the waves of algorithmic and audience capture dynamics. But he's certainly not a journalist, and he's certainly not attached to a journalistic institution. And so, how do we maintain relationships of trust when a lot of the stuff we're consuming is increasingly individual? And think about it. I mean, 25 years ago, would buy 2 newspapers a day and I would scan them. And yes, I am, sort of overloaded in subscriptions to different publications, and I always try to scale that down. But I still mostly follow individuals. They're often institutionally affiliated individuals, but I still follow individuals. And then there are individuals I follow, individuals you follow, who are not affiliated to anything. And how do we maintain relations of trust there? Because, of course, if I don't like something on the BBC, there are procedures for complaint, actually, that are quite bureaucratically formalized. They might not work perfectly, but they're there. And I know what to do. And I also know what regulations and laws different institutions have to comply with. But how do we sort of make this work when we have got a relationship between somebody who is just operating as a freelance communicator, freelance expert? They might even be publishing their own books, writing their articles, doing their videos, but they're not affiliated to anything. It's just them. And of course, relations of trust there are really important, not just because you are giving an extraordinary gift right now as you're watching this, because you're giving something your time. I don't want to say you're giving me your time, but I think you're giving, well, you are, but I think even more importantly, you're giving a certain kind of social practice your time because you think there's something beneficial about participating in that social practice. Now, it sounds like a silly social practice. There's a dude who chats into a screen, and then you listen to the dude about his chats in the screen, and then you type something back at the dude or back at other people listening to the dude. That sounds completely ridiculous and like a total waste of your time. But you don't believe that. You think there's an important social practice there. But how do you judge that it meets your standards and it meets the standards it should meet? And how do you judge that you're meeting your standards when you're consuming it? And how do you judge that you're not merely just consuming it, right? Like a popcorn you bought at the cinema, but that it's actually something healthy for you and transformational? That's a hugely important conversation that will only get more important over the next decade or two in our society, simply because our institutions are not collapsing, but they're somewhat melting down. And so we're going to increasingly rely on having alternative and ad hoc ways of elaborating relationships of trust. Now, one of the things we do here all the time is, first of all, emphasize clearly that I'm not here for you to share my opinion. And I think you all know that. What we also do is we talk about the algorithm sort of once every 6 months, so that you know where you and I stand vis-a-vis the algorithm. Because, what we want to avoid is a kind of innocent but marginal and reckless drift where I start infinitesimally saying more of the stuff you want me to say, which is what it is in my best interest to say, actually. And you've noticed I don't do that. And I'm privileged that I don't do that, because I don't think and analyze the world to then share it with you on a YouTube video. I do that independently, and then I happen to share it with you. And that makes the stability much easier to achieve for me. And we also have an ongoing visceral conversation about trust and transparency, with the understanding that this is not a one-off. It's not a sort of, hey guys, this is how I'm doing this, and then off we go for a few years. No, this has to be an ongoing process. And part of this ongoing process is actually the expectation that you should have around engagement between experts, commentators, content creators, around how they are managing this business of floating either out in open water, right? Which is to say, unconstrained by institutional requirements, the requirements of an editor and so on, that you would get writing for a newspaper. Either unconstrained like that, or constrained, but constrained by the tendencies of an algorithm on a platform like YouTube that has its own sort of purposes that it serves, which are the purposes, for instance, of keeping you longer on the platform, which might not always be compatible with getting you the best stuff. The best way to keep me eating breakfast is to keep giving me macaroons, but that's not health promoting and sustainable. Now, I did a tiny something yesterday that is actually a very important illustration of the sort of thing that I'm now talking about. And it's something that I'm going to practice a lot more of. And that's why it's interesting to air it with you. I went on Silicon Curtain podcast, and we've been talking about having another episode, because I've been 3 times on before, including once when Silicon Curtain was just in the tens and hundreds of subscribers. And I said, yeah, let's do number 4, but let's take the first 5 minutes for me to raise some concerns about that business of being slightly carried away by this sort of complex environment that always acts on you, of forces to do with what your audience expects, forces to do with what the algorithm expects, and where it gently begins to tilt you. And it was a kind of double-purposed intervention from me, whereby I just shared something for John at Silicon Curtain to imbibe and take away and do whatever he wants with. But I also modeled in a public and open way a conversation about how everybody on both sides of these sorts of enterprises, the audiences and commentators, have to be on the lookout for each other's drift, especially because not all, but most creators are vulnerable to drift. And I really don't mean this as an exaggeration. I mean most. In fact, it's more than most. It's probably 90%. Some things make it easier to not, because, for instance, you established yourself before the social media landscape. A good example here is Sam Harris, actually, somebody with whom in the past I would have had such big differences that I wouldn't have been interested in engaging in a conversation about engaging with him. But now somebody who I would actually think of as a kind of sibling, a kind of brother in the internet space, simply because whatever you think of what Sam thinks, he's not changed much since the algorithmic wash and the audience capture wash came over in recent years, the way almost everybody else in what used to be called the IDW, intellectual dark web, has changed, has succumbed to audience capture. And yeah, the fact that somebody who you would not even want to relate to is now like a brother suggests how urgent the challenges we face and what new priorities we have in our informational space. So on the last Silicon Curtain episode, I shared these concerns deliberately with an eye to initiating you, anybody watching, into just this routine, this normalization of a public conversation about relations of trust. Because I think without that, you can't operate properly in this informational environment. And I'm even proud in a way, not that there's anything to be proud of just about chatting online, but I'm a tiny bit proud of the fact that I felt really sick when I was doing the interview, and you can see the interview is really slow. And that's just part and parcel of my recent health deterioration and the volatilities of symptoms that I'm experiencing. Today I woke up paralyzed, actually for the first time in 12 years, but that only lasted a few hours. There's big overlap between my condition and what you would normally expect with multiple sclerosis. But under these conditions of struggling, I still went on, and I engaged in the conversation very, very badly for 5 minutes of sort of, sharing a raised arm and an extended arm around what it means to keep checking and rechecking one's own drift in the algorithm. And of course, it's hard because what you want to do is you want to tell somebody off a bit while holding them up and elevate the audience at the same time. That's a very tricky thing to balance when you're feeling sick. And that's why I'm particularly proud that I did it very badly, but I actually did it. And being infinitesimally proud of that is about the routinization of that discourse. It's not a one-off. It's not something special we do. It's this routinization of discourse around where people's rudders are at. And so do not underestimate the ubiquity of these forces, and also how central the fact that people whose stuff we consume might be drifting all over the place under the impact of forces they don't themselves feel they fully control, how important that is for our democracies, and how important it is to strike a balance there too. so that we use these platforms and they don't use us. And you see this everywhere. And that is why intent isn't what it's about. So many of the biggest podcasts that you can find on YouTube, for example, that are sort of generic podcasts about the curiosities of, interesting ways of thinking about life, they often end up converging on efficiency hacks, certain kinds of health promoting advice, because that just gets the biggest views, gets the biggest positive response from the algorithm. And then you can end up in a situation where a podcast started off by having 17 interesting guests in a half a year slot, and now we have a situation where too many episodes are fix this via this hack so that you can be more efficient with your morning routine, fix that with that hack so that you can lose weight better, fix this and that with those hacks so that you'll live longer. And then you end up in this situation where you have been algorithm captured into what would be the equivalent of talking about a trip around the world you want to do, that you now measure in terms of distance covered and rapidity of distance covered, as opposed to actually the meaning of the places you want to get to. So stay with what I've put on the table, please, ongoingly. It's important, not just for you emotionally and reflectively, but also for you as a citizen, right? It's only if we do this that we're going to encourage more citizens to stay out of these sorts of self-imposed ideological exclusion zones which make them mutually unreachable. Lots of love. Talk very soon.